true murder.
It's a rare insight into a killer's tortured mind.
The most shocking killers in true crime history.
Victims were brutalized, shot, stabbed.
And the authors that have written about them.
Gacy, Bundy, Dahmer.
I would also play with Yash, like if you play with Sam.
The Night Stalker, BTK. Every week, another fascinating author talking about the most shocking and infamous killers in true crime history. True Murder, with your host, journalist and author,
Dan Zupansky.
Good evening. On a cold, windy December night in 1926, hell was unleashed on a tenant farm near Farwell, the last Texas town before the New Mexico border. Thrown to the bottle in fits of rage, the burly man with the smiling blue eyes was in no mood to quarrel with his third wife over his bootleg whiskey and sexual abuse of his stepdaughter. He went from room to room in the house, killing his wife and each child with primitive cutting tools and his bare hands. By the time he concluded his bloody work, he had taken the lives of 9 family members, ranging in age from 2 to 41, committing what one local reporter called the blackest crime in the history of the West Texas Panhandle. Husband, father, uncle, embezzler, serial mass murderer, philanderer, child molester, convict, and military deserter, George Jefferson Hassell was many things to many people, most of them bad. His pattern of familicide crime had begun in 1917 when he slaughtered his common-law wife and her 3 kids in Whittier, California. Later in Texas, he married his brother's wife and became stepfather to her 8 children. Using Hassell's confessions and his many interviews with reporters, as well as the trial transcripts and reminiscences of those who crossed paths with him in Texas, Oklahoma, and California, Mitchel P. Roth presents the first comprehensive account of the life and crimes of one of the least known multiple murderers in Texas, let alone American history. Roth situates Hassell's saga within the 1920s Texas criminal justice system, including the death penalty, which Hassell ultimately received from Old Sparky, the electric chair at Huntsville. The book that we're featuring this evening is The Man with the Killer Smile, The Life and Crimes of a Serial Mass Murderer, with my special guest, journalist and author and professor of criminal justice and criminology, Mitchel P. Roth. Welcome to the program, and thank you so much for this interview.
Well, thank you for having me. Thanks.
Thank you so much. First off, tell us how you came to be the author of this book.
Well, as it turns out, one of my favorite courses to teach has been on murder, serial homicide, and mass murder. And in my early years teaching, I had a young man come up to me after class and tell me that he was related to somebody that was the 5th white person to be electrocuted in Texas and had committed mass murder. And I don't think he really knew a whole lot about what he did, but it piqued my interest because I had never heard of this person, and I consider myself an expert relatively on all the major serial killers and mass murderers. In any case, I asked him if he had any records or family documents, because a lot of people come up with these, stories and can't document them. And it turns out he did. And he was kind enough to make a copy of what had been gathered by his family members who had gone up to the Panhandle in the 1980s, interviewed some of the last surviving jurors and witnesses, and, basically had put it into this very short family manuscript. So anyway, I held on to it because I had a lot of other book projects going, and I kept telling myself, this is going to be my next book. This is going to be my next book. And I finally got to the point about 3 years ago, right before a COVID outbreak, that I had time to go up to the area that his family had been to and look for court transcripts and go to all the spots and start documenting it all for myself and going full throttle on writing this book. And as a result, I found a lot of interesting facts. I found a lot of interesting inaccuracies in the family manuscript. And as I went on and did further research, which entailed lots of newspapers from around the country, entailed, even some pulp nonfiction, detective magazines from the time period, as well as using archives in Austin, the Texas State Library, and in Huntsville, the Texas Prison Museum. So I was able to cobble together the story of a guy who didn't leave much of a paper trail. He was uneducated, but very smart, very cunning. And what we know about him, most of it comes from him. So whenever that happens, you need to go look at the ancestor record. You need to go try and, find birth records, family records, and all of that. And apparently there weren't many people in his family that were proud of him, and he kind of was lost to history. And I have a huge true crime library in my office at home and at school, and I've never come across his name, which I'm kind of surprised since he had 13 victims in total, and that's at least 13 when you consider, other killers.
Now, let's talk about the early years, as you call it. He's the youngest of 7 children, and his mother is Martha Jane Stovall, and his father is James William Hassell. So tell us where they resided and where their background was, and a little bit about what you could cobble together about his early life.
Well, the family, mostly his immediate family, was in the Fort Worth, southern Oklahoma area, just north of the Texas border. And he came from a long line of people that work pretty much agricultural jobs, farming, and that sort of thing. And it went as far back as I could, where I could find information, and found probably the person that he probably got a lot of his traits from. It might have been a grandfather who had been a familiar presence in the court system in another part of Texas for arson and some other things, but nothing as nefarious as what he did. And, the most interesting things I found was that almost every account of the story has his father being poisoned by a second wife and him deciding in his young teens to go and kill that family. And he admitted this was his first impulse to commit this type of crime, killing a whole family. Mm-hmm. Well, turns out, looking through Ancestry.com and other sites, the parents didn't die when he said they did. He wasn't out on his own as early as he said he was, and he didn't commit any murders before, as far as we know, I should say, his 1917 slaughter of his first family.
Mm-hmm. But you do talk and do have some substantiation of his earliest criminal career. So you talk about in 1907, he was indicted for embezzling $50 from his employers. Now, tell us a little bit about his early criminal career and where he ends up and how much time does he do. Tell us about the results.
Well, he was working for a guy that had a gin mill up in the Fort Worth area named Sid Ross. And he became kind of a mentor. I'm sure he wouldn't want to be called a mentor after what happened with his life. But he, basically gave, George Hassell, advice, gave him a job, and unfortunately gave him some responsibility, which entailed, going into town to deliver, some cotton and, do some trading. And he had some money that George claimed that he fell in with some bad hombres and they spent it all. And of course, that was the story of his life, deflecting his bad behavior on other people as well. But in any case, he ended up getting arrested for embezzlement. He was about 17 years old at the time and pushing 18. And he was sentenced to 2 years in prison. And what this meant at that time was serving a time in the different prison farm units in the Texas criminal justice system. And, these have had, justly terrible reputations over the years. And, he documents some of the things that happened to him. I was very lucky in that I was able to find his records in the Texas State Library of what farms he worked on. And I was able to figure out what his tasks were. And, when he talked about what he had to do, whether it was working on a turpentine farm or cutting sugar cane at these different places, this was some of the information I could actually validate. But, that was for very short periods at each, but enough to give you a taste of Texas justice.
You say that he was released in March 1909, and he saw a recruitment sign, Men Wanted. Tell us what he does, what decision he makes at that time.
Well, he was like many of his ilk. He had poor impulse control, and he would often, make decisions and then think about it later. And in this case, he thought about joining the military might be a good job. And he doesn't really go into a lot of detail, but apparently he joined, and apparently he deserted several days later, as, many people have done in the military, but, he becomes a serial deserter, essentially.
You say that right after that, he goes and looks for a job. So he goes to who and asks for a job once again?
Well, he goes back to Sid Ross thinking that, perhaps that he'd done his penance and all of that. And Sid Ross actually gave him another chance, so kind of a forgiving type of guy, it seems.
Mm-hmm.
And he helped set George up on his own farm with an agreement that they would split some of the profits. George also got married. He met a young lady. And what's interesting is during this time is Sid Ross, his employer, evidently, he knew the family of the woman that he married. And he also was familiar with George's sister, who was often kind of his only family member to give him any type of sage advice. And anyway, ultimately, George did everything he could to kind of make sure that this situation didn't work, and he ended up leaving to find a job somewhere else, leaving the farm, and eventually, as he claimed, leaving his wife and child, even though he claims there was an agreement for them to kind of separate and they would get back together once he found a job.
You write, though, that in truth, they saw his abusive nature, and mother and child took off to their family. And meanwhile, the family had always thought knew he was either a freshly released con or just were suspicious of him in general and tried to dissuade their daughter from being with him in the first place.
Well, the interesting thing is that we know probably less about this wife than any of the other women that played a central role in his life. And anyway, he talks about her the most, that she was the love of his life, and that, they communicated by letter once a week, and then she stopped writing, and he blamed it all on the family that knew he had been recently released, ex-con, and didn't want him married to her. Well, in any case, he acted like she left him and kind of hid out from him and, really destroyed his ego and his life. And I bought into this, not to get too far ahead on my research or whatever, but I bought into this until the very end. And I found a letter written 40 years after his death by his only biological son, by his wife. And, in the letter, he had written to the Texas Department of Public Safety saying he wanted to get information on his father. He didn't know a lot about him. And so anyway, he said the reason they left was because they were afraid he was going to kill them. And this was right before I turned my manuscript in. And this kind of filled in a nice big gap there, showing that, from the very beginning, that he was a familicidal type of, individual.
Absolutely. After this, you write that he enlisted the Navy in San Francisco under his real name, and because he feared his earlier desertion from the Army under his mom's maiden name, George Stovall, could be revealed through fingerprints. What happens as a result of this plan of his?
Well, he, as I said, he probably joined the Navy up in that area because that's, he was in California around this time and looking at, where the bases were and all that. And he deserted shortly after that as well. And, one of the problems with his desertion record is I couldn't find any of it in the military records, and I couldn't find it in any of the prison records because he claimed he'd served time in Leavenworth and Mare Island in California and a couple other places. So the only thing I could go by was the years in which he really wasn't active doing anything else. And there was like a 3 or 4 year gap before World War I, or leading up to World War I, where he must have been either in jail or, on the lam somewhere. But I do believe that he spent 2 years in succession of jails. I don't know which ones, but he claimed he was in Virginia. He claims he was in California. And without those records, you cannot substantiate it. But, just from everything I've learned about him, this is what I assume looking at a lot of different accounts.
Once he's released from prison, you write that he tries to reconcile with Minnie, and she was with her family in Texas. What happens with this attempt to reconcile? And what does he do afterwards?
Well, he claims that a couple of times he wanted to see his son, James Delbert. And, so he would buy gifts and he wanted to, come visit her and the family. And, she finally let him, according to his accounts and others, see the kid as long as he didn't share the fact that he was the father. And anyway, none of these visits went well, and he ended up kind of being ostracized from the family and just basically told to, hit the road and don't come back. And after leaving the Fort Worth area, he claims that he ended up in San Angelo, Texas. And in San Angelo, he met a woman named Marie Vogel. I really doubt that this actually happened. I mean, it's a nice story, but in any case, she apparently had a boarding house and he sweet-talked her, and pretty soon they're living together. And she had a biological child, and she was separated from her husband in San Diego. And so they agreed to hit the road and go to California and, kind of start over together. One of the problems with this story is, she's got this kid, and that reminds him also of one of his child. He's never mentioned as he's talking about his road trip and some of the things that he pulls along the way, where they, try to pull these extortion schemes, luring men into the bedroom when he's not there, and him coming upon them and, demanding money to allow the person to leave. It just, it just doesn't, this bunco scheme and all that, it doesn't sound right. I think what probably happened is he never met her in San Angelo because there was no reason for her to be there. She had no family or friends there, and that he probably met her when he went to California and got a job working on a ranch where she was working as kind of a caretaker maid and had her child there. That's what I think happened. I mean, it's a great story, like most of his stories, but, looking at, whatever records I could find, there was nothing to substantiate that. I couldn't find her in any type of telephone directory or anything from that time period in San Angelo, Texas. And, San Angelo was kind of the frontier. What is she doing out there?
You write that she was born Marie Serlin. Her sister was Gertrude Hoffman, and she lived in Pittsburgh. She's a central character in this story as well. She said she knew him only as a ranch hand named Baker. So tell us what happens after with this relationship.
Well, he ends up on this ranch, living on a doctor's spread outside Whittier, California. And, he's basically a ranch hand. And, from what I can determine, she was working there as well. And her sister came to visit and was introduced to him. And it seemed they were the only two people on the ranch. They were the caretakers, and in all probability were a couple by then. And, he introduced himself as George G. Baker, and, basically was trying to, of course, hide his background. And one of the things they needed to do, since she was married, was to assume the facade of being a married couple with a child in order to be accepted there. In any case, they end up getting two other children as well that they supposedly got from an orphanage, claiming that they were for a rich person. And they ended up with these two other kids. And really, it's hard to tell how they got these two kids. Some accounts say the sister brought them to them. Others say that they got them through some type of orphanage arrangement. But in any case, by this time, about 1917, him and Marie and these three little kids, and they're all under the age of 6, are living on this ranch. And the sister goes back home, back to the Pittsburgh area, and never sees her sister again. And George ends up telling people when she disappears and the kids disappear that they had moved on. She'd run off with another guy to Australia or San Francisco. And he continued to live on the property that they were renting in Whittier.
You write, though, that there was a next door neighbor, Mrs. Shanker, and her daughter, Myrtle. What did she notice and observe a few weeks before this disappearance?
Well, they had seen George digging under the house and in the driveway and that sort of thing. They didn't know exactly what he was doing. George would have an explanation later on, but, basically removing dirt. And shortly after they noticed all this, the family had disappeared. And he continued to work under the house and live in the house. And they asked him, because they knew her a little bit. They would come over and visit with Marie and liked her very much, and questioned, well, where'd they go? You would think they would say goodbye. And he said, they just took off. And this becomes his mantra. mantra whenever there's a family disappearance throughout the rest of his life.
You write, though, that the next door neighbor is pretty persistent and reports her suspicions to a police officer. What happens as a result of that? She points to activity in this garage.
Right. Everything seemed kind of fishy to her, and she contacted the Whittier constable's office, and they sent over a guy named Bob Way over to the house, and he sounds like he just did pretty much a cursory inspection. But by this point, George had murdered the family and buried them under the house and did a very good job of it. He would say that to his dying day, that he did a great job, getting rid of the bodies. And he couldn't come up with anything. He couldn't find the bodies or, anything like that. And he still knew this family as George G. Baker. And this would become a problem later on when authorities are trying to, find George Hassell in Whittier at that time, which they would not find.
So you write that Gertrude continues and is persistent with police and continues to query them that what might have happened to her sister and the children. However, there was no report back from them of any progress in the investigation. And as you say, George G. Baker, as he's known, leaves town. And now he leaves with his real name, George Jefferson Hassell. He joins the Merchant Marines, as you say, and works in the oil fields based on your research in 1922 and 23. But on several occasions, you write that he visited his brother and his large family in Blair, Oklahoma, on a ranch between 1920 and 1924. Tell us about Tom, his brother, and his wife, Susan Ferguson, both 19 years old.
Well, Tom was his only brother, and apparently he was the closest sibling to him in his rather large family. And, and since his brother and his family all lived on a farm and, pretty much were very provincial folks and just stayed in one place, he would come back with all of these stories from California and the military. And no doubt he talked much about prison, but he, was a favorite, especially among the adolescent and teenage girls in the brother's family. Mm-hmm. And by this time, he had 8 children and soon would be his wife, Susan, would be pregnant with another child. Well, in any case, for some reason, they allow one of the daughters to go to California with George on a trip. And this is around 1922 or so. And she comes back, or she stays out there, and apparently she's pregnant. And George admits to having slept with her and, didn't go into a lot of detail, but it was pretty obvious to understand this. And so she was going to stay in California and look for a husband, in his words. Again, she was still a minor, when this was happening. And he goes back and, to see the rest of the family. Again, he's very popular with them. He's a joker, always a smile on his face. I mean, he's a complete chameleon. He's everything that you want him to be when you want him to be it, essentially. And, on these trips back home, really nothing really happened of note except for the pregnancy. And he tried to, pretend that he had nothing to do with it. And I think his sister-in-law, believed that he had impregnated her and, this was a long-running issue. And the brother, seemed to be a down-to-earth, successful, hardworking guy. Apparently, he had some health problems at this time. And, he was well known in the community. And George was kind of a cipher, when he came to visit. He was just kind of the brother that was there. And anyway, one day they're working in the corral, by most accounts, and George claims that his brother was kicked by a mule and killed. And they were the only two in the corral at the time. And so everybody, went by, George's count. And, if you look at the death certificate, it said he died from a hernia, some type of hernia. Mm. And it, just it didn't sound quite right. And a lot of people suspected, that it might not have gone down that way. But in any case, there are still others that suggested, maybe there'd been some hanky-panky between George and Tom's wife. Others suggested that maybe they got in a fight over him impregnating the daughter. We'll never know, what the tension and story was, or if he really was killed by it was a mule, actually, killed by the mule. We really don't know that.
Yeah, you're right. That it was a strangulated hernia, but she got a modest insurance policy payout. You say about $16,000 in 2020 terms of money. What happens, weirdly enough, and we mentioned it in the introduction, what happened shortly after? between the two?
Well, he ends up marrying the brother's wife. They take a biblical approach to this, taking over the brother's family. And she's what's called a Russellite, kind of like a Jehovah's Witness. And they consulted the Bible together and thought that it would be okay if they married and he'd take over raising the 8 children, and this was like 3 months after the brother was killed. And in Oklahoma, I'm sure there was a lot of whispers going on. And, they felt the best action would be to hit the road, with the family and with the insurance payout, essentially.
And where did they go to December 1925?
Well, they end up, and, it's not real clear why they ended up there, but they went to Farwell, Texas, or just outside Farwell, Texas. And they end up becoming tenant farmers on a judge's land there. And they're only there for, they're there for the next year. The kids are in school there. He's making his presence known in town. He's kind of a loud type of guy. He's someone that makes his presence known right away. And I doubt this town had ever seen someone like George Jefferson Hassell. And the wife worked hard doing, the chores that a Plains woman would be doing. And apparently, they did a good job, keeping the property up and all of that. In fact, neighboring farmers said, he did a much better job than would be expected. But really, any of his jobs in California, no one really knew him. Nobody could really speak to, what kind of made him tick. And so, all of it was that smile of his that was so disarming.
You write by the fall of 1926 that the couple is quarreling quite a bit. And he claims that she's always taking the side of the children. This is a 5-room house with 10 people. And you write that by December 26, 1926, he had amassed a respectable amount of property, including 13 head of cattle, 10 horses and mules, chickens, rabbits, and hogs, and plenty of feed and farming equipment. Tell us what Mrs. Hamlin, the landlady, Judge Hamlin's wife, what does she notice on October of 1926 concerning the property?
Well, one of the first things she noticed was he had 2 of his kids building a kind of a storm cellar or some type of, pit that he would claim would be for protection, from storms and that sort of thing. Because they already had a root cellar for keeping things cold and all that in the ground. And she was always wondering why they needed to build another one. And then trying to think, the family kind of disappears out of nowhere. And what led up to that was the fact that the wife and George have been quarreling. This is the Prohibition era. She's very religious, and Russellites don't allow alcohol in the house. And he always has a kind of a bit of an alcohol air to him. And he goes out in the barn and drinks whiskey from time to time. But I think even worse than that, he apparently had impregnated another one of her children, one of his former nieces.
Wow.
So now he's impregnated 2 nieces that are his stepkids. And, he really doesn't want to hear about it when he's going to bed, that he has done this. And when he comes to bed and he has alcohol in his breath, and she basically kind of chases him out of the room temporarily, it kind of starts the tragedy rolling that would, take place.
You write that the baby is sleeping with them. The 2-year-old Sammy is with them in the bed. The children are divided up in the separate 5 rooms. The older son, Alton, is away working, I believe.
Right.
And so tell us what it seems happens that night, December 2nd, and why.
Well, it seems that night, as you noted in the prologue, all hell was unleashed. He said he didn't remember doing it, but he picked up some type of ball-peen hammer and started beating his wife with it once she told him for the last time, talked to him about the alcohol. And when the baby started crying, who was in bed with her, he killed the baby as well. And he finished it all up by strangling them. And so he decided at that point that, once he started, he had to finish the job in his terms, and which would mean killing the rest of the kids. And so he went from room to room, killing them in their sleep, and until he got to 2 of the, teenage, preteen boys who were hardy farm workers. And they gave him, quite a fight. And he ended up having to get a shotgun, which was the only gun that was used in these killings, to kill one of them. But he strangled all the other kids, the really young ones, and he used razor blades. And, it was a very personal type of killing spree. could have been done much easier with just a gun. And so anyway, he was worried that, he knew he had to get rid of the bodies because his oldest son was supposed to come back the next day. Alton was about 21 and he was out on a work crew. And so he had to, develop an alibi and all of this, explain that they had all gone off to Oklahoma when in fact he had buried them all in the pit that he had dug. And the question, remains, did he dig this pit ahead of time? Was this something that was pre-planned,
right,
or was it spontaneous? And I have a tendency to believe that it was pre-planned since it was kind of similar to his first mass murder.
Now, he had to wait for Alton, and so he made preparations. Then Alton arrives to demonstrate this person's diabolical nature. What is the interaction that you write about with he and his son, Alton?
Well, George tells Alton that the family had gone up to Oklahoma, up to shallow water, and he would be following suit. Some of the explanations he gave is, they weren't comfortable there anymore or this or that. And Alton, had a tendency to believe what his uncle said. And so they sat down, had dinner. George got him drunk, basically. They played some cards. Alton went to bed, and he didn't notice anything out of the ordinary in the house when he was there. And in the middle of the night, George went in and shot him almost point blank in the head with a shotgun. And he would later say he died the easiest of all of them, which is pretty much true. But at that point, he'd wiped out, the 9 family members. Luckily, the first, the girl that he had a child with had moved to California, had stayed there and found a husband. So she was the one remaining member of that family. And nobody heard a thing. Nobody heard the shotgun or anything like that. And he got everybody buried. And interesting, he, rather than flee right away, he figured, well, I stayed around the last time I buried the 4 bodies and nobody found out and I just stayed in the house. So he decided to do that here. But I think also there was a financial reason too. He wanted to sell all the farm equipment and, everything that he could. He found somebody to take over the lease from him. And, one of the interesting things leading up to this is his landlady, Miss Hamlin, and noticed he had some scratches on his hands and on his face, and someone else had too. And this was after he had killed the family. And he told them he'd fallen off a horse into a stubble pile or stubble bush, and that's how he got them. But it's first started, giving people, reason to, question, his story about, well, did they actually leave? And also, why would he fill that cellar in when they just, opened it and, he wasn't responsible for filling it. He was just a tenant farmer. So everybody kind of marveled at that. But he started advertising a auction that he was going to have of all of his equipment, all of his farm animals and everything. And the auction basically took place right over the graves of his family. And, over 150 people came to this. I mean, there's not a whole lot to do on the high plains. And these were times for, families, husbands and wives to get together and talk and share stories. So anyway, he sells almost everything. And, really nobody's questioning anything except the women. There's several women, including Mrs. Hamlin, and they decide to go into the house which was supposed to be off limits. And they find suitcases full of children's clothes and things that his wife would have taken with him when they were going up to, their new home. And also she left behind all of her religious books. So they started, really questioning this. Mrs. Ford, Mrs. Hamlin, they went to their husbands with their suspicions. And then the husbands took it further and went into town and talked to law enforcement.
Let's use this as an opportunity to stop for a second to hear from our sponsor, which is Talkspace. When it comes to therapy and psychiatry, getting the help you need has never been so simple. When you're able to access your provider from the comfort of your device, it means mental health care can be on your schedule. And alleviating the wait times to get an appointment or the travel time to an office can free up time for the rest of your life. Talkspace is so convenient and accessible, it helps me feel supported around the clock. Talkspace lets you send messages to your dedicated therapist in the Talkspace platform, so you can update them on the challenges and triumphs you're facing in real time. You don't have to wait for your next session. With Talkspace, you set goals with your therapist, and they hold you accountable and make sure you're really progressing. Therapy can help you shift your perspective, find tools to cope in difficult times, and be a guiding light. Talkspace is mental health care that meets you wherever you are. It simplifies taking care of your therapy and psychiatry needs because it eliminates the need to commute to appointments, miss time at work, or line up childcare in order to attend sessions. Plus, instead of waiting for an appointment, you can send text messages to your therapist and let them know the issues you're facing in real time. It's mental health care made easy. As a listener of this podcast, you'll get $100 off your first month with Talkspace. To match with a licensed therapist today, go to Talkspace.com. Make sure to use the code TrueMurder to get $100 off of your first month and show your support for the show. That's TrueMurder at Talkspace.com. Now, Mitchell, you were talking about that he has covered up his crimes, he believes, but there's a neighbor that has seen this trenches that he had built weeks before and noticed his suspicious behavior. And the women in there that are neighbors are also talking to people like their husbands, J.O. Ford, and other people in the community, and they go talk to the sheriff, as you had mentioned before the break. Tell us what happens with their investigation. Tell us how they proceed.
Well, when George comes into town occasionally, that's where the bank is and everything. And, basically they want the sheriff and the district attorney for Palmer County want him to come in and just to talk to them. And he really seems, he's not that suspicious about what they want, although anytime you're called into a sheriff's office, you get kind of nervous. But he thought he'd covered all of his tracks pretty well. And so got to the point pretty quickly, where'd your family go? And he went with his old story, and he basically told them that, that they could send a telegram to a certain person in shallow water that would say that the family got there safely. And so the attorney wanted to arrest George, but, they both got their heads together, the Sheriff Martin and the attorney, and decided, they would just keep an eye on him as he went about his business. And he told the bank to let them know if he was withdrawing money or doing anything that might suggest he was ready to flee town. So they had an eye on him, and their suspicions mounted and were finally, confirmed when they got a telegram back from the person they sent it to saying that the family never got there, the family's not there. And Hassell, didn't know that this was done, at this point. And so in any case, he goes about his business, goes back home. He has dinner with the new lessees who are living with him, a husband and wife. And that night, after meeting with all of the people in town, he was starting to, feel the walls kind of collapsing on him, that he might, be in, danger of, being caught. And in the middle of the night, he yells out that, for the guy who's leasing the house to come in his room, that he needs help. And he's got blood all over him. It turns out he'd stabbed himself a bunch. And he said, go get the sheriff and go get, the doctor and so forth. And so it looked like his attempt to kill himself. He didn't say why or anything like that. And obviously, as soon as this took place, people began to put two and two together, perhaps, that he felt guilty or, he just couldn't take it anymore. So they end up, the sheriff comes in there and with the help, and they take him to the sanitarium, the Baptist sanitarium in Clovis, which isn't real far away, and they treat him, and he survives all of this. But at the same time, everybody is convinced that the secret to where the family is, especially once they got the response that they hadn't reached it, that they were in the filled-in cellar, root cellar.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And they get a group together, they unbury the bodies, they find it all out. And George, meanwhile, he's been treated at the hospital, he's in jail. He doesn't know the bodies had been found, and he doesn't know that someone did not support his contention that his family had reached where he said that they were going.
Right away, you write that the first discovery is the most horrific. It's the baby and a baby's arm and up to an elbow and a baby's hand. And so the gig is up, but he doesn't know. He's not aware that these discoveries have been made. And the sheriff wants to use a ruse with him to try to get him to confess potentially. So what happens as a result of this ruse?
Well, they go to, the jail, and they go to, the jail where he's, recovering and basically tell him, again, they go over his story and they say, well, we got an answer back. Your family never reached there. And, at this point, he kind of gives up the subterfuge and, kind of cops to what he did.
He gives the details, the horrific details of what he does in this confession, doesn't he?
Yes. He kind of relishes, in fact, repeating it over and over again.
Now, of course, the police, the sheriff, is making arrangements, but also at the same time, they realize very, very quickly that maybe the story of his brother's accidental death, there might be something more to it.
Right. From the very beginning, George claimed that he wasn't even in the vicinity when the brother was killed, that he was down in New Orleans waiting for a ship because, a merchant marine ship. But he says this in quite a few interviews. But then you have the other side. There's lots of accounts that he was the only person there when this took place. And so, he protests a little too, strong, in this situation. And people were wondering, did he kill the brother? The fact that this seemed to validate a good possibility of that. And of course, it brings into question, well, if he killed the brother, who else did he kill? Because eventually they'll find out, the first mass murder was in 1917. The second was in 1926. And, those were his only murders. So it brings up a lot more questions as far as his, the death toll.
What's interesting, we didn't talk about how it comes that he confesses to the earlier murders of Marie and the three children. How does that come about? You write about it with Deputy Hawkins.
Yeah, he's in the Plainview jail, and they don't have him under a lot of security. Simply, he's, badly injured. He'd stabbed himself in the stomach and arms and that sort of thing. But he called Deputy Hawkins in to tell him that, basically there's, since you know about this, well, this wasn't my first rodeo, essentially. And, I'd killed a family of 4 9 years earlier, and the bodies have never been found. And, most people thought, George was kind of a braggart that, this was a bit of braggadocio on his part. And since this crime had never been reported. So they checked with the Whittier police and so forth, and they had no reports of a Hassell family missing. They had no reports of any people missing at all there. And, and it's almost like he wanted to, prove that, he was, much deadlier than they thought. And so he couldn't remember where the bodies in the house were. And so here we have him in jail and, basically under his real name, Jefferson Hassell, George Jefferson Hassell. And they can't find any records of him ever living in the Whittier area. He was living under the name G. Baker at that time.
Right.
So anyway, a picture appears in the newspaper of him after his arrest. And he's in, I think the first picture of him was in his coal, working on the railroad tracks in the oil industry in California. And one of his ex-neighbors kind of notices, wasn't that our neighbor? And here 9 years later, he's being accused of committing a mass murder, and they're kind of putting it all together. And so anyway, they reach out to, authorities and say, well, we think this is who the person is. This is where he lived. Everything seemed fishy the way that family disappeared. And, they couldn't find the bodies. The same cop that had gone out there in 1917, the last name was Way, I think his name was Bob Way, they still couldn't find it. So, George didn't like to be called a liar. That's the one thing. He didn't mind being called a pedophile, a murderer, but don't call me a liar.
Yeah.
And he drew a map when he was in the Walls unit by this time in Huntsville, and he drew a map where to find it. And they published it in the LA Times. In fact, it showed where it was. And ultimately, he was able to, lead them to the bodies pretty quickly and validate what happened.
Let's use this as an opportunity to stop for a second for these commercials. Now, we mentioned, and you write about all of the horrific details that he fills in for authorities, but he does not give up the details of the murder of Marie and the 3 kids. He refuses to do that, but promises that he will do that at a later date as the state is asking for the death penalty, and he believes that that might be his fate. Tell us about this seeking the death penalty and also his demeanor, everything that fascinatingly happens after he is indicted for this and is set to be executed.
Well, one of the things that comes up in the book, and maybe it slows the book down, is it talks about the appeals process, because it took over a year to execute him after he'd been sentenced, and he had to be resentenced, and, getting into a lot of the judicial mumbo jumbo. But, he had no compunction about, sharing the details of all his crimes with other prisoners and everybody else. And, he wanted to make authorities wait until he was basically in the chair before he'd reveal, all the information on what took place in Whittier. But I think the more they doubted him, the less he could wait, because he wanted that office. He, wanted them to say, well, he's telling the truth more than anything else. And so he gave it up, a lot earlier than he had planned to, where the bodies were buried.
You talk about alienists, the term for psychiatrists at that time, and then also interviews by reporters, prestigious reporters. What did they remark? And you chronicle some of the things that they saw and observed in speaking with him.
Well, the psychiatrists, first of all, psychiatry was, still kind of in its infancy, in terms of dealing with psychopathy and other types of mental illnesses. But, they basically, once they spent a lot of time with him talking about it, they would often say afterwards, we have no better idea why he did it after speaking with him than we did before it, because he could never explain why he did it, or didn't want to explain why he did these crimes.
They tried to portray him as insane despite him confessing to these crimes, and despite maybe the rules of insanity being new, what was made of this plea of insanity.
Well, the problem with it's more illegal than a medical distinction, and it's very hard to prove even today, even though it occasionally happens. But it was more his lawyer that wanted this at first. George didn't want to say he was insane or anything, but he kind of went along with it as time went on. Once he was on death row in Huntsville, he realized that his only chance of not being executed was to claim insanity. And so, of course, this came up with the resentencing hearing and all of that. And it pretty much fell on deaf ears simply for the fact of, how much planning was entailed in this crime and the previous crime. And he was as sane as you could be, considering the ability to tell right from wrong. Because, the idea that he would kill himself, over the bodies being found, he knew that was wrong. And having, remembered that he had the bodies buried in Whittier. So psychiatric side of things, never really played out for him. And the thing is when you're sentenced to death, you're given an automatic 30 days, 90 days, to basically be observed by psychiatrists and everything. And one of the problems was they'd sent him from Plainview after he'd been sentenced back down to the death row in Huntsville, when in reality he should have been kept up in Plainview until the appeals process played out. So he actually had 2 stints on death row, and one of them was shorter than the other. But he never really talked about being insane or anything. The only thing he could say is, he doesn't know why he did these acts.
You write about, as well, the trial itself that garnered the headlines throughout America and probably internationally as well at that time. Tell us about some of the highlights at this trial, and your commentary, or one of the jurors' commentary, on the length of the trial, the length of the jury process, and then the deliberations.
Well, there was dozens of witnesses, but the trial was, relatively quick for a death penalty trial. And the jurors basically pretty much came to a conclusion very quickly once they were set to make their decision. And they waited longer so that it would seem that they put more thought into it. But, it was pretty much to them an open and closed case. And they also wanted to, there was a lot of animosity. There was talk about lynch law, people coming in, breaking him out and hanging him and that sort of thing. Although, a lot of it was just bluster. And, they basically waited until most of the people were gone to, from the courtroom to give their, sentence again of death.
I found it interesting. I'd never read something quite like that, where the prosecutor gives his scathing indictment of George Hassell, and the defense lawyer breaks out in tears and runs out of the courtroom till he can compose himself.
Yeah, that was, kind of wacky because, once the whole process went down, his defense attorney was nowhere to be found. And he was the one who was supposed to, do the original appeals process. And so this kind of, screwed that all up. But I think what bothered people the most, even more than the killings, was his sexual molestation of his nieces. And I think that bothered them the most. And this came out during the trial. It wasn't published in most of the newspapers, but it was in the court transcripts, his confession. Because he confessed to all of this. He basically distanced himself from the second pregnancy simply for the fact that she was, between 13 and 15 years old, and he was trying to blame it on someone else who was on the scene at the time it supposedly took place. And in any case, this to most people was seen as the worst part of the crime.
You write that he entertained journalists and other people that he was granting interviews till just before the execution, right before. But they all commented on his demeanor. Again, you write about they weren't aware of psychopathy, pathology, and so they weren't accustomed to it, and so they commented.
Yeah, they were very mystified later on when they, kind of shared their interviews with other people about how someone could be so calm, how someone could talk how much they loved children, which is one of the things he was always saying. He just loved children. In fact, the first child that he killed reminded him of his biological child. And here's a person that could strangle them with, no problem at all and talk about it later on with absolutely no remorse. People would say, they would say, well, sorry you did this, you're sorry you did that. But he, there was no mea culpas, forthcoming from him.
You posed the question in the epilogue that, why are legions of criminals and murderers with much less blood on their hands? Why are they famous and this family annihilator is not?
Well, that's an interesting question. And the thing is that, you wonder why it hasn't garnered the attention of so many other crimes. And, this was one of the, questions that came up with, would anybody be interested in reading this book? Because it took place kind of in an area that really there's not a whole lot of the historical references about. But it took place out in the countryside in the 1920s, basically, as far as a small community, most of the people wanted to move beyond that. But no matter what, when you have a crime in that area, it stays in kind of the DNA of the community for a very long time. And basically, I think that's why other people have never heard about this, which is surprising. And it made me wonder, well, what other cases are there like this? Mm-hmm. And so right now, as I'm looking at my next projects, I'm trying to find cases that no one's ever written about because, how many books can you write about Bundy and Dahmer and, the Hall of Fame of serial killers. Mm-hmm. But I think the community just wanted to get beyond it because they didn't want to be marked by this crime. It's not great for Chamber of Commerce material. And so surprisingly, until recently, they were doing a local play, a theater play based on the crime. And interesting, when I went up there to start my research, I would go into different places, I thought might be helpful. In fact, the hospital where he was treated, where he tried to kill himself, is an antique store now. And they had kept a lot of the hospital architecture still there. And I went in there and spoke to the gentleman who ran the place. And as soon as I said I wanted to talk about the George Hassell case, he was ready to kick me out the door because people don't want to talk about it, talk about a Nobel Prize winner or, prize-winning cow or something, but not about a murderer. But I won his confidence, I will say, over time. And so anyway, he shared a little bit of information. But, all the witnesses from that time period are gone. And the only thing you have are family members that were involved. And you have their stories about what happened. And, and that was the whole idea of this, is to set the record straight and perhaps, bring more attention, to this type of crime, to this crime in the Panhandle. And over time, more recently, I found there's a lot more interest in this book up in the Panhandle than there is anywhere else. So I'm in talks with doing, lectures and book signings and stuff up in the West Texas and Panhandle.
It's interesting. You write about the memorial, basically the historical cemetery plots in 2018. Just tell us, before I let you go, about that.
Well, because of the weather and planes and the winds and everything, the original tombstone was very, very weathered and was falling apart. And, basically this might have shown too that there were, a lack of interest or, a lot of lack of interest of, remembering this particular type of crime. And anyway, a historical group got together and, one of the people that I dedicated the book to a woman named Teresa Ansera, and she's been, one of the facilitators for, making the cemetery look a lot better, cleaning it up and getting with others in the historical associations a new tombstone. And so she gave me a tour, showed me where, this person was buried that was, tangential to the crime. And it was hard to find this cemetery unless you had local knowledge, but it's brought, more attention to it. And there's been some findings, of other graves that people didn't know existed there. I'm hoping maybe this book will bring more attention, to the cemetery as a historical place.
Right.
And in any case, they have a beautiful gravestone there that was donated, as well as all the help to clean the cemetery.
Yes, absolutely. I want to thank you very much, Mitchell P. Roth, for coming on and talking about your book, Man with the Killer Smile, The Life and Crimes of a Serial Mass Murderer. For those that might want to take a look at your work, do you do any social media? Tell us about that.
Well, I'm in the process of putting a website together, but, most of the information on my work can be found just Googling my name or going on Amazon, which, has descriptions of all of my books.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mitchell P. Roth, The Man with the Killer Smile, The Life and Crimes of a Serial Mass Murderer. Thank you so much for this interview, and you have a great evening.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you very much.
Good night.